In a country where discipline and respect are at the heart of the social order, the institutions of the police and the army are not only fundamental pillars, but symbols of an immutable order. Their codes and values are engraved in the stone of national traditions, and their authority cannot be questioned. Every uniform, every rank insignia, every regulation is supposed to guarantee an unshakable hierarchy, an order that we respect blindly. In this environment, mistakes are unforgivable, because they risk upsetting the fragile balance of this well-oiled society. However, despite this rigid structure, human pride, often fueled by fear and incomprehension, remains an invisible enemy. This pride, sometimes repressed under layers of apparent discipline, ends up exploding in acts of violence or rebellion, destabilizing what had been so carefully constructed. Institutions that believed themselves to be invincible sometimes find, on rare occasions, their authority jeopardized by those who are supposed to maintain it. This is precisely what happened one winter afternoon in an austere office of the Ministry of the Interior, a place where honor, hierarchy, and humanity would be tested to their limits. Agent Martin Lefebvre was not a man to be doubted. Formerly a petty street delinquent, he had forged an iron discipline through effort and sacrifice. At 35, he was one of the most feared police officers in the Paris Criminal Brigade. His reputation was not only based on his efficiency, but also on his impetuous character, his stubbornness, and his ability to impose his will in the face of any obstacle. The orders? He received them, but often interpreted them in his own way. He was not afraid to challenge those who attempted to question his authority. For him, the police represented order, immediate action, where the theories and discussions of the military had no place. He considered that the army lived in a parallel world, that of theory and planning, far from the realities on the ground that he faced every day. That day, Martin found himself in a meeting room at the Ministry of the Interior, surrounded by senior civil servants and military personnel. The coordination meeting between the armed forces and the police was a bureaucratic obligation, one of those rituals where people in suits found themselves debating high principles, without ever touching the reality of what was happening in the streets. The military, he said, had no idea of the cost of being confronted with criminals, in extreme situations where there was no room for grandiloquent speeches. In his eyes, there was only distrust and contempt. The room, with cold walls and bricked-up windows, was filled with heavy silence. Each was waiting for the other to make a misstep. Martin, absent-mindedly, looked at the table filled with files, analyzes, and projections. These papers did not interest him. He stood straight, like a soldier ready to respond to an order he might not even accept. He felt the heaviness of the room, the smell of concentrated power, of the hierarchy that was felt in every breath. His clenched jaw betrayed growing impatience. That's when she entered. General Sophie Dumas appeared, an imposing figure in her impeccable uniform. She was a woman in her 40s, with short-cut hair and a steely gaze. His gaze scanned the room, not to seek allies, but to ask the silent question, "Who among you deserves to be respected today?" His career was exemplary, with a military rigor that few could match. She had been trained in the school of toughness and tactics, had lived through international conflicts and peace missions, and had always demonstrated unquestioned authority. Every gesture, every word was calculated. In the army, Sophie Dumas was not only a leader, but a living legend. Martin, despite his reputation and his pride, immediately felt uneasy. There was something in the general's attitude that made him uncomfortable, but he didn't want to admit it. This uneasiness manifested itself in a furtive glance he cast across the room, hoping no one would notice his reaction. He hated being dominated, especially by a woman, especially by someone he considered a member of an institution disconnected from the reality he was experiencing. He saw her as a distant figure, a symbol of icy authority. Sophie Dumas spoke calmly, giving her presentation on a collaborative project between the army and the police. She explained how the two forces should join forces to fight organized crime and internal threats in the country. His voice, calm and measured, resonated like an imperative. She expected no interruption or challenge. But Martin, unable to contain his frustration, stood up abruptly. He turned his head towards her, his piercing gaze filled with challenge. He wasn't going to let her dictate his view of the world without reacting. With an abrupt gesture, he pushed the documents in front of him, as if to indicate that he had had enough of this charade. Do you think the military really understands the reality on the ground? He called out in a loud, almost hostile voice, cutting his words short. He was not looking to discuss, but to destabilize. All eyes turned towards him, some full of embarrassment, others marked by disbelief. The room, which until then had been vibrating with technical discussions and tactical proposals, had suddenly frozen in a heavy and tense atmosphere. Each participant was absorbed by the scene that had just unfolded before their eyes, the magnitude of Martin's gesture disconcerting. But Sophie Dumas did not flinch. She simply looked up from her documents and looked at him, her gaze calm as a calm sea, but icy firm. She remained in control of the situation. I believe, Monsieur Lefebvre, she said in a calm voice, but with unquestionable authority, that everyone has their role and that mutual respect is what allows us to work together. Sophie's words were clear, but the way she delivered them went far beyond simple words. She had not responded to the aggression directly, but she had subtly disavowed him, asserting her superiority without ever overtly humiliating him. There was a cold gentleness in her voice, a precise choice from one who knew the value of measured intervention. She hadn't challenged Martin publicly, but the humiliation was there, beneath the surface, between the lines. In her eyes, Martin was just a man steeped in misplaced pride, and she treated him as such, not out of anger, but out of a sort of cold distance. Martin himself was far from appreciating this approach. Stung, he felt anger rising within him. This feeling of helplessness that he could not tolerate. The general's look, the tranquility and measure of his words, everything about him seemed to ridicule his authority, as if his very existence had just been swept away with a wave of the hand. He had always had difficulty with women in positions of authority, a visceral feeling, a mixture of distrust and frustration, which he had never taken the time to analyze. He stood abruptly, his fist clenched, in a clumsy attempt to assert his dominance. He slammed a file onto the floor, and the sound of the impact echoed like thunder in the confined space of the room. The atmosphere around him became heavier, more dangerous. His gaze fixed on the general, whose posture remained impeccable. He couldn't take it anymore. He crossed the distance between them, his body tense, his mind tormented by rage and frustration. Without thinking, in a fit of madness, he aimed his gun at her, his gaze becoming that of a helpless man, a man who no longer controlled his emotions or his actions. The silence that followed was deafening. There was no more noise in the room, barely the breathing of a few witnesses who were holding their breath.
General Dumas made no sudden movement.
Her gaze fixed on Martin's hand, the gun extended towards her. She was calm, implacable. In that moment, she embodied absolute stability, perfect self-control. She didn't panic, she didn't react with fear. His calm echoed the storm raging inside Martin, a silent reminder of his absolute control over the situation. "Martin," she said slowly, her voice calm but full of gravity, "put down your gun. This is not the path you want to take." Sophie's words, simple, measured, resonated in Martin's mind. But he was lost in his own emotional whirlwind. He could not hear reason, nor understand the wisdom behind the general's words. The shame and humiliation he felt in that moment were mixed with anger and fear. He was too proud to let the situation get him down, too blinded by his wounded ego. But as the silence stretched on, as the eyes of others observed this spectacle, he began to realize the weight of his actions. The seconds passed like hours, and each moment caused his own certainty to waver. His breathing was heavy, his mind foggy. In the end, it was not an act of bravery, but the pressure of reality that caused his weapon to fall. He lowered it slowly, as if his body was waking up from a bad dream, a dream that had almost destroyed him. The others in the room, stunned, rushed to intervene, overpowering Agent Lefebvre in an instant. They didn't hesitate for a second. He had no chance to justify his action. He had crossed a red line that no member of the police would have ever imagined crossing. A police officer had never pointed his weapon at a superior, much less at a woman. It was unthinkable. But Martin had just accomplished it. And, in the space of an instant, he had destroyed any possibility of redemption. General Dumas, without another word, turned on his heel and left the room. She did not seek to demonstrate her superiority or to further humiliate the man who had just attacked her. She knew that the weight of the incident would be much heavier than any words. Martin's humiliation was inevitable, but she refused to be carried away by revenge. She chose to follow the procedure, to wait for the end of the investigation, and to ensure that justice would be done in full respect of the law, without giving in to emotions or indignation. The incident spread quickly, with lightning speed. The images of the policeman pointing his gun at a military superior were found everywhere. On television, on social networks, and in the discussions that were happening in every corner of the country. The shock was profound, far beyond what Martin had imagined. The French, already in the grip of internal political tensions, did not understand how such an act could have occurred within the ranks of their own security forces. The image of a police officer supposed to protect and serve, so deliberately threatening a higher authority, resonated like a thunderbolt in public opinion. A few hours after the incident, the Minister of the Interior announced the immediate suspension of Martin Lefebvre. The announcement sent shock waves through the corridors of power, and rumors began to circulate about the seriousness of the situation. The next day, an administrative investigation was opened, and he was dismissed without notice. The speed of the government's reaction, although expected, reinforced the idea that such actions could not go unpunished. A military authority put in danger by a member of the police could not be tolerated, whatever the context. General Dumas, despite the trauma of the incident, remained calm and serene, even if, in her thoughts, a deep disappointment gnawed at her. She had always believed in mutual respect between security forces, a belief that came from her experience in the army, where hierarchy and discipline were taught above all else. Yet she knew that Martin's humiliation was inevitable. His gesture left no room for ambiguity. But she refused to respond to violence with violence, not allowing herself to be trapped by the temptation of revenge. Rather than gloat over her downfall, she chooses to follow the procedure, wait out the investigation, and ensure that justice is served, while remaining true to her commitment to serve with dignity and honor. For her, the integrity of her position came before any personal satisfaction. Beyond the defeat of Martin Lefebvre, what stood out the most was the psychological impact of this act. It was not just a question of lost careers, but a deep fracture in the balance of institutions. Respect for hierarchies and authorities, from the army to the police, found itself weakened. But Sophie Dumas also knew that this kind of fracture could, over time, be healed, if we stuck to the fundamental principles of responsibility and reconciliation. Martin Lefebvre, now suspended and degraded, found himself unemployed, rejected by his peers and consumed by the weight of shame. What he didn't see coming was the loneliness that would come with it. Everything he had known up until then, respect, recognition, even arrogance, was crumbling around him. He tried to defend himself in the media, saying he had acted under pressure, that he did not actually want to threaten the general's life, but his excuses were in vain. Footage of his act had been broadcast nationally, and no words, no matter how sincere, could erase what he had done. His once promising career had shattered like glass under the impact of a thoughtless move. Martin, accustomed to seeing others submit, found himself faced with an authority greater than his own, that of justice, that of the hierarchy. By attacking a legitimate authority figure, he had, in a sense, attacked the very system of which he was a part. The system rejected him in return. Sophie Dumas, for her part, had never sought to further humiliate Martin. Although her act was unforgivable, she knew that redemption required taking responsibility for mistakes. She did not seek to exploit her power to push the fallen agent further. Rather, she simply asked that he take responsibility for his actions, while remaining true to his own commitment to serve his country with dignity. This attitude, marked by firmness but also compassion, reflected his deep conviction that justice, in its best moments, does not only consist of punishing, but also of allowing rehabilitation. The months that followed were difficult for Martin. He wandered from one small mission to another, seeking to regain his place in a world where he had lost his legitimacy. It was a long road, full of frustrations and questioning. Little by little, however, the truth dawned on him. What he had done was not simply an error of judgment, but a profoundly destabilizing act, not only to the institution, but to his own soul. He realized that he had not only lost his job, but that he had lost the trust of his colleagues, his family, and himself. It was a foggy afternoon, during a public event, that Martin saw General Dumas, as if destiny had led him to where he must finally face his demons. He approached slowly, his heart pounding, and in a respectful tone, he asked her forgiveness. It was an act of humility, of acceptance of one's own weakness. Sophie looked at him for a long time, her gaze piercing but calm, as if she were searching his soul. She had never harbored a grudge against him, although the act he had committed was serious. But she also knew that the only way to help him rebuild himself was to give him the keys to redemption. "You acted in a moment of anger, Martin," she said with wisdom in her voice. "But it's up to you now to rebuild what you destroyed, and that starts with yourself." She left him with these words, because she knew that Martin's path would be long, but it was now up to him to follow it. This was how Martin Lefebvre slowly began his journey of redemption, far from the spotlight and the noise of the media. With humility and hard work, he began to rebuild himself, little by little, one day at a time. He was no longer the arrogant police officer he had been, but a man ready to learn from his mistakes, to regain his dignity, and to understand that true respect was not a given, but something that had to be earned every day.